Alrighty, welcome back to the Modern Josephus. We're going to go ahead and do war and expansion. One of my favorite subjects because it deals with some of Mexico. And I grew up in Mexico. I'm an American though, but I did grow up in Mexico. And so some of its history is interesting, and the parts that intertwine with the United States I've read a lot about. A lot of different authors I've read about the Mexican War, Texas War for Independence, and just how it all relates to Mexico. So we'll see how much he talks about it here, at least from the Mexican perspective. And if he doesn't, then I will address it myself. So let's go ahead and get into this. Let's get into this.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to discuss how the United States came to acquire two of its largest states, Texas, and there is another one. Mr. Green, I believe the answer you're looking for is Alaska. Oh, me from the past. As you can clearly tell from the globe, Alaskan statehood never happened. No, I am referring, of course, to California. Dan, are we using your computer today? Oh, Stan! We've talked about westward expansion a few times here on Crash Course.
I wonder if he got rid of that because he was getting a lot of flack from that. But we'll see in the next video, right?
But it's usually about, like, Kentucky or Ohio. This time we're going really west. I mean, not like Hawaii west, but sea to shining sea west. So you might remember that journalist John O. Sullivan coined the phrase manifest destiny to describe America's God-given right to take over all the land between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, regardless of who happened to be living there.
And as a Christian, I do not believe in manifest destiny. Some of it came from the idea that, oh, well, you know, the Israelites were told by God to take over the land of Israel and wipe out all the pagan nations that were there. And yes, God effectively did have Israel do that. However, the United States is not Israel. It is not the new Israel. It is not Israel. All right. God has not revealed to the United States and told them to wipe out all pagan people that live in their domain. Okay. That God never asked anybody to conquer it. All right. So the whole philosophy and idea behind manifest destiny is not a really good interpretation of the Bible. Anyway.
Sorry, Native Americans, Mexicans, French fur trappers, beavers, bison, prairie dogs, passenger pigeons. I'm not going to go so far.
Good book to read that I really enjoyed about, you know, kind of this movement west. Centennial by, what's his name? McKinnon? Yeah. So, yeah, that's a pretty good one. They made a show, too, that's aight. It's a aight.
To give God credit for America's internal imperialism, but I will say that our expansion had a lot to do with economics, especially when you consider Jefferson's ideas about the empire of liberty. Dan, did I just say liberty? That means technically I also have to talk about slavery, but we're going to kick the slavery can down the road until later in the show, just like American politicians did in the 19th century.
Oh, and I have a lot to say about slavery. So if you're a pro-Confederate type of a guy, listen to this. Have your thoughts challenged.
In 1860, nearly 300,000 people had made the trip that has since been immortalized by the classic educational video game Oregon Trail, which, by the way, is inaccurate in the sense that a family of 6, even a very hungry one, cannot eat a buffalo, but is extremely accurate in...
Yeah, the Oregon Trail is actually a pretty cool game. I haven't played it in ages. Probably when I was 12, 13 was the last time I played it, but it was pretty neat. And yes, I don't think I ever made it to Oregon because I always died of dysentery. So, yeah.
Disease. So Oregon at the time was jointly controlled by the U.S. and Britain. Northern Mexico at the time included what are now Texas, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, and California. But New Mexico and California were the only two with, like, big settlements. About 30,000 Mexicans lived in New Mexico and about 3,500 in California. And in both places, they were outnumbered by Native Americans. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. When Mexico became independent, there were only about 2,000 Tejanos there. So to encourage economic development, Mexico's government granted a huge tract of land land to Moses Austin. Austin's son Stephen made a tidy profit selling off smaller parcels of that land until there were 7,000 Americans there. This made Mexico nervous, so backpedaling furiously, Mexico annulled the land contracts and banned further emigration into Texas. Even though slavery was already abolished in Mexico, up to now they had allowed Americans to bring slaves. Austin, joined by some Tejano elites, demanded greater autonomy and the right to use slave labor.
Okay, so well, maybe he did request that. I had always heard that the one reason why the Mexican government got mad with the Americans was because they brought slaves. So,
labor. Thinking the better of it, Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna decided to assert control over the rest of territory with an army, turning the elite's demands for autonomy into a full-scale revolt for independence.
okay. So let's get into the politics of Mexico. So Santa Anna wasn't just a general. He revoked the Mexican Constitution of 1824 and made himself dictator of Mexico. This didn't just anger the Texans. If you look at the Alamo, and I know that for all of Johnny Cash's song that, you know, the U.S. flag was flying over the Alamo, that is not true. The Texans and the Tejanos flew the flag that resembled the Mexican flag, except for instead of having the eagle in the middle, it had the year 1824. And what they were fighting for, especially the men at the Alamo, because they didn't know that Texas was declaring its independence at the time that they were being under siege. So what they were fighting for is just for the Constitution of 1824 to be put back in place. And they weren't the only ones in Mexico. Chihuahua, there was a small revolt as well. And I think in Guadalajara or some other state, there were like 2 other states besides Texas where a small revolt happened. It wasn't as big as the one in Texas, but there was unrest. And Santa Anna actually sent troops to quell that unrest in those 2 states. But there were a lot of people who did not, in Mexico, who did not like that Santa Anna took over power and revoked their constitution. It wasn't like a happy time there. And so that's what was going on. That's the backstory behind why the Texans decided to revolt, was because the Constitution of 1824 had been revoked. And Santa Anna was going to go up there and put this rebellion down.
On March 13, 1836, Santa Anna defeated the American defenders of the Alamo, killing 187 or 188, sources differ, Americans, including Davy Crockett. The Texas rebels would remember the Alamo and come back to defeat Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto, and Mexico was forced to recognize Texas's independence. So Texas became the Lone Star Republic and quickly decided that it would be much better to be a less lonely star and join the United States. So in 1837, Texas's Congress called for union, but all they heard back was, "Not so fast, Texas." Why? Because Texas wanted to be a slave state, and adding another slave state would disrupt the balance in the Senate. So Jackson and Van Buren did what good politicians always do. They ignored Texas.
So there was that. But let's get into the backstory a little bit. Santa Anna decided, he's captured at San Jacinto, and he says, okay, I will recognize your independence. So he's recognizing the independence of Texas as the dictator of Mexico. What ends up happening is Santa Anna goes back to Mexico. Well, the Mexicans aren't happy. They lost a big battle. Their dictator was captured and is a loser. So they turn on him. And they exile him to Cuba. Put him on a ship, exile him to Cuba. So the Mexican Congress never approved of Texas independence. And there's a quasi-war between Texas and Mexico still. no big battles like the Alamo or San Jacinto, but there's still that hostility. And I think like Mexican cavalry units are going up into Texas and causing disruption, things like that. And so Texas, that's the main reason why Texas wants to join the Union. Because they're still getting harassed by Mexico. And, they know that in the long run, they can't keep their independence. So they requested the Whigs, of course, because of slavery, because also they don't want a war with Mexico. They oppose the Texas entering the Union. So it was a combination of both. Yes, slavery probably more had to do with it, but the Whigs were just not into expanding and taking territory from Mexico and entering into bad relationships with Mexico.
And then, after Martin Van Buren wrote a letter denouncing any plan to annex Texas on the grounds that it would probably provoke a war, Democratic Convention Southerners threw their support behind slave-holding Andrew Jackson pal, James K. Polk. Polk just managed to get a presidential victory over perennial almost president Henry Clay, and seeing the writing on the wall, Congress annexed Texas in March of 18...
I forgot that Henry Clay did a lot of launched a lot of presidential attempts. And it was John Tyler who actually annexed Texas, which is interesting because this is why the parties have learned not to elect people from the other party. So William Henry Harrison elects Tyler as his vice president. Tyler's a Democrat, and he does that to win the Democrat votes. Harrison, of course, is against annexing Texas. Because he doesn't want to get into the slavery issue and because he doesn't want to create problems with Mexico. But he dies, and Tyler is a Democrat, and he is for admitting Texas as a state to increase the slave state, increase slave states, and he doesn't mind a war with Mexico because they're eyeing not just Texas, but they're also eyeing more land from Mexico in order to expand slavery.
1945, days before Polk took office. Congress then forged an agreement with Britain to divide Oregon at the 49th parallel, which restored the slave state-free state balance in the Senate. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Hey, Stan, can I get the foreshadowing filter? I wonder if we're going to be able to keep that slave state-free state balance forever. The land-hungry James...
And that's what the whole issue was. This is why I reject the notion of states' rights as a reason, at least in this instance, as a reason for leaving the Union. Because the only thing this was a legislative battle that was battled out via constitutional means. And the reason why the South didn't want more northern states was because they recognized that under the Constitution, if you have more northern states, they can pass an amendment that will end slavery. And on the northern end, they recognize that if there's more slave states can outnumber northern states and pass an amendment to codify slavery into an amendment, via an amendment into the Constitution. So that's just the political game. That's how the Constitution was set up. All right, and that fear that now there's going to be northern states is what caused the South to lose. So basically, for me, in my opinion, they left the Union because they didn't like that the rules of the game were now going against them. You know, I mean, in that case, the Cleveland Browns might as well just leave the NFL because, you know, they just can't compete. All right, that's almost the exact same analogy. All right, we're leaving the NFL because we can't win. That would be the analogy. All right, so there you have it.
James K. Polk had another goal as president: acquire California from Mexico. He tried to purchase it from Mexico, but they were like, no, which is Spanish for no. So Polk decided to do things the hard way. He sent troops under future President Zachary Taylor into this disputed border region. As expected by...
And the problem with that was there had been a promise, an understanding between the Mexican government and the U.S. government that area between San Jacinto and the Rio Grande would be disputed. They couldn't send troops into that area, and until there finally was an agreement that could be made on where the boundary was. And James K. Polk, wanting to start a war, decided, hey, I'm just going to send this cavalry unit in. and some Mexicans heard of it. They moved troops in there who ambushed this cavalry unit, and Polk used that as an excuse to start the war.
By which I mean intended. Fighting broke out between American and Mexican forces. Polk, in calling for a declaration of war, claimed that the Mexicans had, quote, shed blood upon American soil, although the soil in question was arguably not American, unless you think...
Yes, and the American government recognized that.
Think of America as being, all of this. A majority of Americans supported this war, although to be fair, a majority of Americans will support almost any war.
Again, it was divided between North and South. Northerners did not want this war. And even if you read, the Whigs did not want this war. It's interesting because U.S. Grant, actually he was a Democrat at this time, but Ulysses S. Grant wrote in his memoirs that he was against the war. Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, both Whigs, even though they were slave owners, were against the war because they recognized it was all about taking more territory and creating more slave states. And even Abraham Lincoln stood up in the Senate and denounced Polk for it. So the Whigs were against this war.
I'm sorry, but it's true. At least at first. It was the first war fought by American troops primarily on foreign soil, as most of the fighting was done in Mexico. Among the dissenters was a Massachusetts transcendentalist who is probably better known than the war itself. Henry David Thoreau was in fact thrown in jail for refusing to pay taxes in protest of the war and wrote On Civil Disobedience in his defense, which many American high schoolers are assigned to read and expected not to understand.
I think I have that book.
Lest they take the message to heart and stop doing assignments like reading on civil disobedience. Another critic was concerned about the increase in executive power that Polk seemed to show, saying, allow the president to invade a neighboring country whenever he shall deem it necessary to repel an invasion, and you allow him to make war at pleasure. That critic was none other than noted peacenik Abraham Lincoln, who would go on to do more to expand executive power than any president in the 19th century, except maybe Andrew Jackson. Right, so Santa...
I mean, some of the things where they say he expanded more than any other president is not really true. I mean, if we're talking about, for instance, him putting down a rebellion, George Washington did that with force, with troops. There was no battles or major war, but he did, create an army to go put down a rebellion. If we're talking about infrastructure and how the federal government needs to construct a transcontinental railroad, and I say this because it's out of experience, with debating with other people, well, that's no different than what most Whigs thought, and people like John Quincy Adams actually did more probably than even Abraham Lincoln to expand, canals and railroads and things like that. And even I, as a conservative, I do agree that for major roads and for major railroads that go through different states and things like that, I think that the federal government is within its right to pay for those things, sponsor those things, and use taxpayer money for it. And the main reason is because that's one of the things that Adam Smith in his book Wealth of Nations was for as well. So it's pretty consistent with a capitalist view of the economy. But there are a few things that the government can involve itself in, but most of it is not. And, not to get too much into politics, but today we do way more spending than what even Lincoln would have wanted.
Santa Anna's army was defeated in February 1847, but Mexico refused to give up, so...
That's Veracruz. I've been there before. Beautiful town.
Winfield Scott, who had the unfortunate nickname Old Fuss and...
Been to Mexico City. Been to that church that you see in the background many times. It's right in the center of Mexico City.
And Feathers captured Mexico City itself in September. A final peace treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, was signed in 1848, under which Mexico confirmed the annexation of Texas and further ceded California, as well as several other places that would later become states, but we couldn't fit on the map. In return, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million and agreed to a no-backsies deal in Reed, Texas, thereby freeing Mexico from the shackles of Amarillo.
So just imagine this, and I don't know, maybe you guys know, but I don't know of any other nation or civilization in the history of the world up to this time that ever conquered territory and then paid for it. Either Americans were horrible at imperialism, or they were trying something new. I don't know which.
I'm sorry, Amarillans. No, I'm not. I am. I'm not. I am. This is great, Stan. The people of Amarillo hate me, also the people of New Jersey. Alaska is in the green parts of not America. We don't even have Arizona and New Mexico on the chalkboard. Pretty soon I will have alienated everyone. Anyway, thanks to the land from Mexico, our dream of expanding from the Atlantic to the Pacific was finally complete, and as always happens when dreams come true, trouble started. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, between 75,000 and 100,000 Spanish-speaking Mexicans and 150,000 Native Americans were under the jurisdiction of the United States. Despite the fact that the treaty granted Spanish-descended Mexican male citizens legal and property rights, the Mexicans were still seen as inferior to Anglo-Saxons, whose manifest destiny it was, of course, to overspread the continent.
And that's interesting. I wonder if they also were allowed to vote in elections. I wouldn't be surprised if they were, because Texans and Tejanos always got along together.
And the fact that these Mexicans were Catholic didn't help either, especially because in the eastern part of the United States, there was a rising tide of anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant sentiment known as nativism. And there was a new...
Again, I don't know how much that affected Texas. Again, seeing as Tejanos and Texans got along pretty well together.
Political party, the American Party, dedicated entirely to such sentiment. They were referred to as the know-nothings, because when you asked them about their politics, they would answer that they didn't know anything. And indeed, they didn't. This was not an expert branding strategy, although they did manage to win an unexpected number of local offices in a state heralded for its ignorance. Massachusetts. You thought I was going to say New Jersey, but I'm trying to make nice with the New Jersey people because they take it pretty personally. Meanwhile, in California, there weren't enough white English-speaking American residents to apply for statehood until gold was discovered in 1848, leading, of course, to San Francisco's NFL team, the San Francisco 48ers. By 1852, the non-Indian population in California had risen from 15,000 to 200,000, and it was 360,000 on the eve of the Civil War. Now, not all of those migrants, mainly young men seeking their fortunes, were white. Nearly 25,000 Chinese people migrated to California, most as contract workers working for mining and railroad companies. And
another interesting thing is, even though the other guys were white, a lot of them were from Europe. They were Irish, they were German, they were Swedes even, so they were Europeans. A lot of Americans from the West came also. But yeah, there was a lot of Europeans that came too.
Women too, who ran restaurants and worked as cooks and laundresses and prostitutes. But the ratio of men to women in California in 1860 was 3-to-1. Ah, schmerg. It's time for the mystery document. The rules here are simple. I read the mystery document and I'm either shocked by electricity or by the fact that I got it right. We would beg to remind you that when your nation was a wilderness and the nation from which you sprung barbarous, we exercised most of the arts and virtues of civilized life, that we are possessed of a language and a literature, and that men skilled in science and the arts are numerous among us, that the productions of our manufactories, our sale and workshops form no small share of commerce of the world, and that for centuries colleges, schools, charitable institutions, asylums, and hospitals have been as common as in your own land. And we beg to remark that so far as the history of our race in California goes, it stamps with the test of truth that we are not the degraded race you would make us.
I'm guessing it's a Chinese person that's writing this. That's my guess.
So it's someone who said, we had a great civilization when you were a wilderness, plus they called us barbarous, so it's either ancient Rome or China. I'm going to lean toward China. That only gets me halfway there. Now I have to think of the name of the person, and I don't know any famous people from mid-19th century China who lived in the U.S. People say I can't sing. Norman Ossing? Who the hell is Norman Ossing? So these days, California...
Not even a picture of Norman Ossing.
Rich, groovy, laid back, oh, your back hurts, here's some pot attitude. But that was not the case in the 19th century. The California Constitution of 1850 limited civil participation to whites. No Asians, no black people or Native Americans could vote or testify in court. Indians were kicked off their land if it had any mineral value, and thousands of their orphan children were sold as slaves. And all of this led to the Indian population of California dropping from 150,000 to about 30,000 between 1848 and 1860. So it wasn't at all clear whether California was the kind of place to be admitted to the U.S. as a free state or as a slave state. The Missouri Compromise was of no help here because half of California is below the 3630 line and half is above it. So a new Free Soil Party formed in 1848 calling for the limiting of slavery's expansion in the West so that it could be open for white people to live and work. I just want to be clear.
Now that idea is not something new that just came about from the Free Soilers, all right? The Founding Fathers were against the expansion of slavery, which is why they, the Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery, and Thomas Jefferson was trying to get the Louisiana Purchase to ban slavery. The Founding Fathers did not want slavery to spread. And Abraham Lincoln actually recognized that in many of his speeches.
Clear that most of the people who were for limiting slavery were not, like, unracist. So they nominated the admirably whiskered Martin Van Buren for the presidency, and Van Buren and Democratic nominee Lewis Cass then split the northern vote, allowing the aforementioned Zachary Taylor to win. So in 1850, when California finally did ask to be admitted into the Union, it was as a free state.
And that was based on the Californians. The Californians wanted to be a free state. When they got together, there were even slave owners who got together. And they decided, and this I read from H.W. Brand's American Colossus. I believe that's the book I read it from. But he was saying that the slave owners there voted to be admitted as a free state when applying for statehood. So that, to me, is very interesting.
Southerners freaked out because they saw it as the beginning of the end of slavery. But then, to the rescue came Henry Clay for his last hurrah. He said, "We can kick this problem down the road once more," and brokered a 4-part plan that became known rather anticlimactically as the Compromise of 1850.
Okay, so we've talked about John C. Calhoun. We've talked about Henry Clay. The one we haven't talked about is Daniel Webster. That guy was a great guy. And so basically, American politics was like this. You had your Southerners, which were the ones, the John C. Calhoun, slavery's a moral good, we should expand it, things like that. You had your Henry Clay, who was like, well, we should compromise on everything. And then you had your Daniel Webster, which was like, no, we need to limit slavery. We cannot keep on spreading slavery. And there were just some great debates between Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun. They got into it with each other in debates, like some of the best debates you've ever read. H.W. Brand's Era of the Founders, great book. And you can read about the debates that they both had on the floor of Congress over slavery.
Historians, can you name nothing? The 4 points were: 1, California would be admitted as a free state; 2, the slave trade, but not slavery, would be outlawed in Washington, D.C.; 3, a new super harsh fugitive slave law would be enacted; and 4, popular sovereignty.
So it looks like that, so the slave trade was outlawed. Now, obviously, it's not the slave trade as far as Africa is concerned, all right, because that was ended in 1808. But this must have been like, bringing slaves from the South and selling them on the auction blocks in Washington, D.C. So that's a pretty good compromise to end the slave trade there. So that means no more auction blocks in Washington, D.C. The new fugitive slave law, I'm guessing that this just reinforced the old fugitive slave law, the one that's in the Constitution. And it's probably because a lot of states were starting to be lax on that. And then popular sovereignty is the idea that the states get to decide whether to have slavery or not, which, again, I think that's anticlimactical to what the Founding Fathers wanted. They believed that the federal government had the power to limit slavery in the territories and the states that would be formed out of those territories.
The idea was that in the remaining territories taken from Mexico, the local white inhabitants could decide for themselves whether the state would be slave or free when it applied to be part of the United States. The Compromise of 1850, a great reminder that nothing protects the rights of minorities like the tyranny of the majority. There was a huge debate over the bill in which noted asshat John C. Calhoun was so sick that he had to have his pro-slavery, anti-compromise remarks read by a colleague.
And that was in the debate with Daniel Webster. Why aren't you guys mentioning him? Listen, if you guys want to read about somebody, to me, Daniel Webster is the greatest political figure at this time. The greatest political figure. He gave a great speech giver. A great speech giver. He was just gifted for that. You know, a lot of people will say Henry Clay was because he was able to compromise, and even Lincoln looked up to Henry Clay. But for me personally, it's Daniel Webster.
On the other side, New York Senator William Seward, an abolitionist, also argued against compromise based on slavery being...
Daniel Webster was the biggest one! Oh, my word. Oh, this is getting frustrating.
Wrong. But eventually, the compromise did pass, thus averting a greater crisis for 10 whole years. Ralph Waldo Emerson predicted that if the United States acquired part of Mexico, it would be like swallowing arsenic. And indeed, arsenic can be a slow-acting poison. Now, I don't think Ralph Waldo Emerson was a good enough writer to have thought that far ahead, but he was right. Some people say that Manifest Destiny made the Civil War inevitable, but as we'll see next week, what really made the Civil War inevitable was slavery. But we see in the story of Manifest Destiny the underlying problem. The United States didn't govern according to its own ideals. It didn't extend liberties to Native Americans or Mexican Americans or immigrant populations or slaves. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week, when things will get much worse. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller.
All right, so yeah, that was a good video. I was able to add some context there to some of those things. And poor Daniel Webster. Poor Daniel Webster. I feel so bad for him. Not Noah Webster. Noah Webster was a dictionary guy. But man, Daniel Webster. Man, great politician. You should read up on him. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. Like, share, subscribe, comment down below. It's going to get spicy. It's going to get spicy because there might be some of you who are more pro-Confederate and states' rights and all that kind of stuff. But I'm sorry, I'm a Hoosier. I'm from the North. My ancestors fought for the Union, so, you know, and I've read a lot on the Civil War, and I just fall on the side of the Union, of Lincoln. So, but I'm here. I can criticize Lincoln. I criticize Lincoln, too. I'm not, you know, I'm not gonna... I do think he's the, you know, my second favorite president, and probably I'll give you my reasons why in the next video. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to release that one today too, because this one was supposed to be released yesterday, and I did release it. Audio was horrible, so I'm re-releasing again. But then tomorrow or today we'll do the election of 1862. Not 1862, but 1860 as well. All right, so we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. We got 40 subscribers. We're doing good. Let's get to that 50. See you next time.